Ever since I first watched Clannad and Toradora, I've always been a fan of slice of life anime. My love for the genre was amplified even more after I abandoned action anime seemingly for good. A show like Fairy Tail should not have been the reason for me to abandon an entire genre, but unfortunately, it was the reason I abandoned action anime almost entirely. It wasn't like with my distaste for harems and ecchi anime, where I abandoned the genres after seeing many different series that repeated the same awfully annoying tropes over and over. I still find it hard for me to actually enjoy action anime, primarily because I find the constant dialogue during fights to be irritating or cringeworthy, but as I've expanded my genres in anime since coming back to it after watching Violet Evergarden, I've come to tolerate many of the tropes that I originally couldn't stand in many different genres that I would have previously refused to watch. In order for me to really enjoy action anime in particular, there has to be something about the show that captivates me. With slice of life anime, the thing that captivates me is the genre itself, whereas the action genre rarely captivates me on its own. In other words, whether it's because of the story, characters, or premise, when I actually make it through more than 3 episodes of an action anime, it's safe to say that I really enjoy it. Fate Zero is one such action anime. I have been told to watch the show over and over by several of my weeb friends since I was in junior high. Some of them have reverted to more subliminal means of convincing me. After years of ignoring their suggestions, brushing Fate off as just another awful action anime, and calling Saber waifu bait without actually knowing anything about her character, I finally caved and decided to give the show a watch. After all, it had been sitting on my plan list of over 100 entries for quite some time. I live by the 3-episode rule when watching a new show, so although the first episode was slightly difficult to follow with my lack of knowledge on the Fate series as a whole, I stuck with it. Before I knew it, I found myself constantly clicking on the next episode until it was 2 in the morning and I was already a third of the way done with the first season. I loved the characters and the fact that the servants were each based on figures from legends and history, but even more than that, what captivated me was the organization of the plot. From episode 1, it is clear that Fate Zero does not follow a traditional plot diagram. The show doesn't follow the common plot organization of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. That's not to say it doesn't contain these parts, all plots do. What Fate Zero does uniquely is it focuses more on the neutrality of cause and effect rather than the flow of a traditional plot. Instead of introducing the protagonists along with their goals and why their goals conflict with the portrayed to be evil goals of the antagonists in the exposition, Fate Zero introduces the premise of the show through a lens of near ultimate neutrality. It doesn't introduce the protagonists, it instead introduces many of the characters and their different reasons for obtaining the Holy Grail. They all have their own ambitions and motivations with their own backstories. The show establishes empathy for all of the characters, rather than establishing a majority of the empathy for the protagonists and a small amount for the antagonists. Furthermore, the series does not draw a fine line between who the protagonists and antagonists are. The line is so blurred that it may as well be non-existent. In a traditional rising action, the journey of the protagonist is depicted as it builds towards the climax. Most traditional rising actions simply recount the events of the plot without a specific explanation of the chronology until during or after the climax. Fate Zero's rising action not only depicts the journey of nearly all of the characters, but it also portrays how each event leads to the next. For example, one character does X, which leads to another character doing Y, which leads to Z happening to all of the characters. It's this formula that truly caught my attention at first. However, the reason I continued to watch was that the show maintained this formula throughout the whole first season. A perfect example as to how Fate Zero maintains this neutrality and the cause and effect formula is with the continuous arc in the first season about Castor and Ryunosuke. When Ryunosuke's character is introduced, I first looked at him with disgust. His and Castor's actions could easily be labeled as objectively immoral, even though the phrase sounds somewhat oxymoronic. Although they regularly commit atrocities, Fate Zero does not drop its neutrality with the two characters. They have their reasons for committing atrocities just as much as Kiritsugu has his reasons for obtaining the Holy Grail. Not once throughout all of Season 1 does the show drop its neutrality on the characters, regardless of their actions. Of course, whether moral or immoral, each character's actions have consequences. If said consequences negatively affect any character, the show illustrates the consequences on an emotionally painful basis, regardless of who that character is. Castor and Ryunosuke kidnap dozens of children, murder them, and mutilate their bodies. Kirei's father recognizes this as a threat to the Holy Grail War itself, requesting that the other masters target the elimination of Castor and his master. This leads to Iskandar and his master finding Castor and Ryunosuke's hideout. Once they arrive and witness the remnants of Castor and his master's atrocities, they decide to destroy it. This cause and effect chain eventually leads to the ending of the season, where Castor summons a massive creature in the river. When Ryunosuke and Castor find the destroyed remains of their creation, the show still maintains the basis of emotional pain with Castor and his master, despite their creation being the remains of horrendous murder and mutilation. The main reason I think that I have stuck with Fate Zero is I was curious if it could keep up its consistency. Although I haven't seen Season 2 yet, I have very high hopes for it. My curiosity was primarily a result of my desire to find a show that actually followed through with the cause and effect formula all the way until the end. I didn't know I liked shows that followed this formula until I watched Game of Thrones for the first time. I'll admit, I was thoroughly impressed with how neutral Game of Thrones kept itself despite the very heavy themes covered in this show. I found myself becoming very excited for each new episode. I loved having the liberty of choosing the characters I wanted to root for, knowing that all of them could be stabbed in the back at any second. Then, about halfway through the series, it dropped its neutrality entirely. As a result, the show became another boring rendition of good versus evil, rather than cause and effect. Don't get me wrong, good versus evil and traditional plots work very well in a lot of cases, but I think you should pick one or the other and stick with it. After Game of Thrones lost its focus on neutrality, it became somewhat entertaining to see how the show made desperate attempts to appear as if it was still a cause and effect plot by overusing the shock factor. I'm honestly surprised that I found an anime of all things that did what an HBO original series miserably failed to do. I'm gonna stick with Fate Zero and possibly the rest of the Fate series to see if it can keep up its cause and effect formula that captivated me. Considering it has kept it up this far, I don't expect it to lose it, at least for the rest of Fate Zero. I'd love to see other anime and shows take on this type of formula. It is a difficult thing to do right, and Fate Zero is the perfect example of the formula done nearly perfectly. On a little side note here, before I end this video, I just wanted to say that we reached 200 subscribers on Tuesday. Over the past 2 months, I've experienced more growth on this channel than I ever have in my life. I have no other words to describe how I feel other than I think it's absolutely amazing. I can see a wonderful community brewing here, and I look forward to more people joining it. Thanks to all of you for your continued support, and here's to another 2 months.
Off to see the world, there's such a lot.